Hey everyone, before I tell you what happened that evening, I just want to say thank you for being here. It still amazes me how many of you tune in every week. I see comments from people all over: Dallas, Chicago, small towns in Georgia, even some from way up in Montana. So, where are you watching from tonight? Let me know down below. I always love reading that part. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. It means more than you can imagine. All right, now, let me take you back to that evening in the driveway. Because what happened there changed something in me I didn't even realize was waiting to change. It was one of those late spring afternoons that still carried a chill in the air, even with the sun hanging low and golden. My driveway was speckled with shadows from the big maple tree out front, and I remember thinking how quiet everything felt. I'd just come back from the grocery store, my arms full of bags that seemed heavier than usual. Maybe it was just my mood. You see, ever since my husband passed away 3 years ago, these small, ordinary moments, unloading groceries, locking the car, hearing the distant hum of lawnmowers, felt louder somehow. Like the world was still moving, but I was just standing still. That's when I heard his voice, soft, but with that clear tone of youth that always startles me a little. Need a hand with those, Mrs. Reynolds? It was Daniel, my neighbor's son. He was standing a few feet away, hands tucked in the pockets of his faded jeans, that half smile he always wore breaking into something warmer when I turned toward him. "Oh, Daniel," I said, forcing a small laugh. "I didn't even see you there. You scared me half to death." He grinned. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you. Just got back from a run." He motioned toward his sneakers, still dusty from the road. There was a stillness between us for a second, one of those pauses that stretch longer than they should, but somehow don't feel awkward. Then he stepped closer and reached for the grocery bags. I hesitated at first, my instinct to say, "No, no, I've got it." But something in his eyes made me stop. Maybe it was kindness. Maybe it was that quiet sense of understanding I'd been missing lately. "Thank you," I said softly, handing him a few bags. We walked up the driveway together, our footsteps crunching against the gravel. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and rain. I remember how the wind caught the edge of my cardigan and how he reached out instinctively, steadying one of the bags before it slipped. There was something so simple, so human, in that small gesture. It made me feel seen, and that feeling had become rare. Inside the kitchen, the golden light from the setting sun poured through the window, making everything glow in that soft, forgiving way only evening light can. Daniel started unpacking the groceries without me even asking, placing the milk in the fridge, stacking the apples neatly in the bowl. I watched him for a moment, realizing how much he'd grown. The last time I'd really talked to him, he was a teenager mowing lawns for pocket money. Now he was in his 20s, studying architecture, if I remembered right. His mother had mentioned it once over the fence, saying how proud she was. I remember thinking then how time slips by quietly, almost cruelly. "You always organize things like this," I teased, trying to lighten the air. He smiled, setting down a carton of eggs. "Habit. My mom says I get it from her. I just like when things make sense." I nodded slowly. I used to feel that way too, until things stopped making sense. He looked up at me then, really looked, and that's when something shifted. It wasn't romantic, not even close. It was recognition. The kind that happens when someone younger sees you not as just a neighbor or an older woman, but as a person who has lived, who has lost, who still has light somewhere beneath the dust of days gone by. We talked for a while, about little things at first. The neighborhood, his college projects, the tree out front that needed trimming. But then the conversation drifted, as conversations do when two people stop pretending they're in a hurry. I found myself telling him about my husband, about the way he used to whistle when he cooked, about the empty chair at the dining table that I still couldn't bring myself to move. Daniel listened quietly, not interrupting, not offering platitudes. Just listening. And that was everything. At one point, he said, "You know, my dad left when I was 16. I used to watch your husband working on that old blue car of his. He looked like the kind of man who had everything figured out. I used to wish he was my dad sometimes." His voice cracked just slightly, but he smiled through it, the kind of smile that hides more than it shows. I reached across the counter, placing my hand gently over his. "He was a good man," I said, "but so are you, Daniel." We sat in that quiet glow for a while. Outside, the evening deepened, and the first hint of dusk crept over the street. Somewhere a dog barked, and the world felt small again, comfortably small. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated at the doorway. "If you ever need help with anything, groceries, the garden, anything, just let me know," he said. I smiled. "You'll regret offering that. I might just take you up on it." "I hope you do," he replied, and for a fleeting second, his eyes met mine with that same warmth I'd been missing in my own reflection. After he left, I stood there in the kitchen, surrounded by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint scent of rain coming through the open window. The house didn't feel quite so heavy that night, and as I looked out the window, watching him walk down the driveway back to his parents' house, I realized something. Connection doesn't always arrive in grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it shows up in the form of a kind young man offering to carry your groceries on an ordinary evening, and leaves behind a reminder that maybe, just maybe, you're still part of the world that keeps moving. That was the night Daniel first approached me in the driveway. I didn't know then that it was only the beginning of something quietly extraordinary, something that would make me see myself and life in a way I hadn't in years. The next morning, I woke to the faint rhythm of raindrops tapping against the window. The world outside was soft and gray, the kind of morning that makes you want to stay under the covers with a warm cup of coffee and a quiet heart. But my mind wouldn't rest. I kept thinking about Daniel, the way he'd looked at me with such genuine care, the easy way he listened. It wasn't attraction, not in the usual sense. It was something deeper, something that reminded me of being seen, being valued. And for the first time in a long while, that feeling lingered long after the moment had passed. By the time I stepped into the kitchen, the rain had turned into a steady drizzle. I put on the kettle, reached for my favorite mug, the one with the tiny chip along the rim, and stared out the window. Across the driveway, the Petersons' house looked quiet, though I could see Daniel's old car parked near the curb. A small voice inside me hoped he might drop by again, maybe with one of his polite smiles and a story about school or work. I told myself that was silly. I was 60 years old. He was a young man with his whole life ahead of him. But then again, maybe this wasn't about age at all. Maybe it was about kindness finding its way back to you in unexpected forms. Around noon, I decided to head out to the garden. The soil was damp, rich, and dark, and the air smelled of wet earth and lilac. Gardening had always been my quiet therapy, hands in the dirt, thoughts drifting. But that day, I felt a restlessness that didn't belong to me. I was halfway through pulling a stubborn weed when I heard footsteps on the gravel. "Hey, Mrs. Reynolds," Daniel's voice called out through the misty air. "You're out early." I turned, surprised but not disappointed. He was holding an umbrella, droplets sliding off the fabric as he approached. His sweatshirt clung to him from the rain, his hair a little messy, like he'd run out in a hurry. "Morning, Daniel," I said, smiling despite myself. "You'll catch a cold out here." He shrugged. "I was heading to the garage to get some tools for Dad, but then I saw you out here battling that garden. Figured you might need a partner in crime." I laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in weeks. "A partner in crime, huh?" "Well, I can't promise it'll be exciting. Just a lot of weeds and muddy shoes." He crouched beside me, his hands already in the soil. "That's all right. I like working with my hands. Makes me feel like I'm fixing something that actually stays fixed for a while." There was truth in that. I could see it in his expression, the quiet focus, the way he pressed his palms into the earth with purpose. We worked in silence for a while, side by side, the rain softening to a fine mist. Every so often, our eyes would meet, and a gentle smile would pass between us like an unspoken understanding. At one point, I asked, "Do you ever feel like the world moves faster than you can catch up?" He paused, wiping his hands on his jeans. "All the time, especially lately. Everyone's always talking about what's next. Next job, next step, next goal. But sometimes I think the real moments happen in between all that." I nodded slowly. I used to think the same. Then I forgot how to notice them. Daniel looked at me, his brow softening. Maybe you just needed someone to remind you. Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten, not from discomfort, but from the strange recognition that he was right. There was no pity in his voice, no distance, just honesty. We talked as we worked. He told me about his classes, about how he was struggling to balance school with helping his father renovate their shed. I told him about my late husband's fascination with fixing things, how he'd spend hours tinkering in the garage, humming some old tune under his breath. Daniel listened with that same quiet attentiveness as before, occasionally glancing up with a half smile when something I said struck him. When the rain stopped, the air felt fresher, lighter somehow. Daniel stood and stretched, brushing mud off his knees. "You've got quite the garden here," he said. "It's peaceful." "It used to be," I replied softly. "Then it just became another place to keep busy. But today, it feels different." He tilted his head, curious. "Different how?" I hesitated, then met his gaze. "Maybe it's because I'm not out here alone this time." His expression softened. "Well, then I'll make sure that doesn't happen too often." We laughed, but there was meaning beneath it. When he left, he turned once at the edge of the driveway and waved. I stood there watching until he disappeared into his house, the sound of his footsteps fading into the hush of the neighborhood. That evening, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the garden still glistening under the fading light. I thought about how strange it was that someone so much younger could bring such calm into my life. It wasn't romance, not in the conventional way, but it was something that stirred the corners of my heart that had been asleep too long. As night settled, I found myself smiling for no reason. I realized that maybe connection doesn't need to be grand or dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as muddy hands, shared silence, and the steady rhythm of two people working side by side, healing without even meaning to. That night, before bed, I glanced at the calendar on my fridge. For the first time in years, I caught myself looking forward to tomorrow. A few days passed quietly after that rainy morning, but Daniel's presence seemed to linger in my mind like a melody I couldn't quite forget. The weather had turned warm again, the kind of late spring heat that made the air shimmer above the driveway. I spent most of that morning cleaning the porch, dusting off the old rocking chair my husband used to sit in. It creaked softly when I leaned on it, the wood worn smooth from years of use. For a moment, I closed my eyes and almost heard his whistle again, faint and familiar, drifting through memory. When I opened my eyes, I saw Daniel across the street, carrying a box to his car. He waved when he noticed me. Without thinking, I called out, "Need help with that?" He laughed and shook his head, but then crossed over anyway, that easy smile on his face that had started to feel oddly reassuring. "It's just some old tools," he said when he reached me. "Dad's making me clear out the shed again." I leaned against the porch railing. Ah, the eternal war between fathers and clutter. Exactly. He grinned, setting the box down. "What about you? Taking a break from gardening?" "I suppose so," I said, "just trying to make this place feel alive again. It gets too quiet sometimes." He nodded thoughtfully. looking around at the porch, at the empty rocking chair. It's a nice kind of quiet, though. Peaceful. I smiled faintly. It used to be. Now it just reminds me how much time has passed. For a while, neither of us spoke. The breeze rustled the leaves, and somewhere down the street, a lawnmower buzzed faintly. Then Daniel said, "You know, I always thought you were kind of incredible. You've been through so much, but you still take care of this place like it matters." His words caught me off guard. I laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. Incredible? That's a word I haven't heard in a long time. He shrugged. Well, it's true. Most people my age give up when their phone battery dies. You've kept everything around you alive. That says something. Something in his tone made me pause. It wasn't flattery. It was sincerity. I looked at him then, really looked, and realized how rare it was to have someone speak to me that way, without the careful pity that often came from friends or neighbors. "Would you like some lemonade?" I asked, needing a moment to steady my thoughts. "It's homemade. Well, powdered mix and tap water, but I like to pretend otherwise." Daniel grinned. "I'd love some." We sat on the porch, two mismatched figures under the shade of the old maple. I poured the lemonade into glasses, the ice clinking softly. The sun filtered through the branches, scattering gold patterns on his face. He asked about my husband then, not in a prying way, but gently, as if wanting to understand the shape of the silence that still lived in my house. I told him about our road trips, about how we used to drive without maps just to see where the road led. I told him about the nights we'd sit right here on this porch, watching thunderstorms roll across the hills. "Sounds like he was a good man," Daniel said softly. "He was," I replied. "He had this way of making ordinary days feel special. It's funny. I thought that part of my life was over. But lately, I trailed off, not sure how to finish." "Lately?" he prompted. "Lately I've been remembering what that kind of warmth felt like," I said finally, "and realizing it doesn't have to disappear forever." He smiled, his eyes kind. "Maybe it just changes form." I nodded. "Maybe it does." We talked until the sun began to lower, the sky melting into shades of pink and gold. The air was still warm, but softer now. I noticed how easily the conversation flowed with him. No effort, no need to fill the silence with meaningless words. There was a comfort in it, something gentle and steady. When it was time for him to go, he stood and hesitated, as though he didn't quite want to leave. "Would you mind if I stopped by sometime?" he asked. "Not for anything big. Just to talk, maybe help with the garden again." I smiled, touched by the simplicity of it. "I'd like that very much, Daniel." He nodded and walked down the driveway, his hands in his pockets, the evening light catching on his hair. I watched until he disappeared behind the hedges, the sound of his footsteps fading into the hum of the summer night. That evening I sat on the porch long after the sun had set. Fireflies blinked in the garden, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine. I thought about how strange it was, the way life could surprise you, even after 60 years. I wasn't lonely that night. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was part of something again, even if I didn't yet know what that something was. As I rocked slowly in the chair, I realized that connection doesn't always arrive in the form of grand love or lifelong bonds. Sometimes it's simply a shared silence, a kind word, or a young man's willingness to sit with you on a quiet porch and remind you that life, no matter how still it seems, still has warmth left to give. Summer deepened, and the days began to take on that slow, honey-colored rhythm that only happens when time itself seems to pause. The neighborhood grew quieter as families left for vacations and children stayed indoors to escape the heat. I found myself spending more and more mornings on the porch, coffee in hand, waiting, not consciously, but in that quiet way a heart does when it's found something it looks forward to again. Daniel kept his word. He stopped by often, sometimes just to check in, other times to lend a hand in the garden or fix the small things around the house I'd been putting off for years. It became our quiet routine. He'd arrive with that easy smile of his, and we'd fall into conversation as naturally as if we'd known each other all our lives. One afternoon, as the cicadas hummed in the distance, he showed up carrying a wooden box. "I made something for you," he said, setting it down carefully on the porch table. I raised an eyebrow. "Made something? Should I be worried?" He laughed. "Not unless you hate handmade gifts." I lifted the lid and gasped. Inside was a small birdhouse, carved beautifully from light oak. The edges were smooth, the roof slanted perfectly, and across the front, in neat handwriting, he'd etched, "For the quiet days." I touched the lettering, feeling my throat tighten. "Daniel, this is beautiful." He looked down, a bit shy for once. "You told me how the mornings used to feel lonely. I thought maybe this would bring a little life back." I smiled, blinking away a tear. "You're something else, you know that?" He shrugged lightly. "I just pay attention." We hung the birdhouse together that evening on the old maple in the front yard. The air was thick with the scent of summer rain, and the sky had turned the color of soft amber. Standing there beside him, I felt a stillness that wasn't empty but full, a quiet contentment that reached deeper than words. "Funny," I said, "how a simple thing can make everything feel different again." Daniel looked at me, the golden light flickering in his eyes. "I think sometimes we just need a reminder that there's still beauty left to notice." The way he said it stayed with me long after he left that night. When I looked out the window before bed, the birdhouse swayed gently in the breeze, a promise of new beginnings I hadn't dared to imagine. Weeks passed, and the birdhouse soon became home to a small family of sparrows. Each morning I'd sit on the porch with my coffee, watching them flutter in and out. The world felt alive again, and so did I. Then one afternoon, Daniel stopped by, quieter than usual. "I wanted to tell you," he began, "I got an internship out of state. It's only for a few months, but I'll be leaving next week." For a moment, I couldn't find my voice. I smiled, though it trembled a little. "That's wonderful, Daniel. You must be thrilled." "I am," he said. "But I'll miss you." I looked at him then, really looked. It was a moment full of all the things we hadn't said aloud, the gratitude, the affection, the quiet understanding that what we'd shared mattered, even if it was brief. "You've given me more than you realize," I told him softly. "You reminded me that there's still warmth in the world, that I can still open the door to it." He reached out, hesitated, then gently took my hand. "And you reminded me what kindness looks like when it's real." We stood there in silence, hand in hand, while the sun dipped low behind the rooftops. There was no sadness, just a sense of peace, two people who had met in the right moment of their lives, when they both needed something only the other could give. When he finally turned to go, he paused halfway down the driveway and called back, "Take care of the birdhouse for me." I smiled through the tears I hadn't let fall. "Always." The sound of his footsteps faded, and I stood there until the light began to fade too, the first stars just beginning to flicker above. That night, I sat alone on the porch, but it didn't feel lonely anymore. The world had changed in small, gentle ways. The garden looked brighter, the air felt lighter, and somewhere deep inside, a door that had been closed for years was open again. Sometimes I still hear his voice in my memory, soft, thoughtful, filled with that quiet strength that touched me when I needed it most. And when I see the sparrows dart in and out of the birdhouse he built, I smile and whisper a thank you to the wind. Because in that driveway, on that ordinary evening months ago, I didn't just meet my neighbor's son. I met a reminder that even at 60, even after loss, Life still has a way of surprising you with something tender, something good, something worth holding on to.